The Panasonic LUMIX S5 is an affordable, full-frame camera that honestly has way more horsepower than a camera at this price point really should. So, with all the horsepower and the hype behind this camera, does it live up to the hype, or is it another camera that's just destined to be in the shadow of Sony and Canon? And make sure to watch this video all the way through because I had a lot to say about this camera and I covered a ton of material. Let's get right into the fun stuff because there's 3 things I really want to cover with this camera: the overall look of this camera, the video features, and the raw horsepower and data rates. So first of all, this camera looks great. Usually I'm not a big fan of Panasonic color science, but honestly, this camera looks like a professional commercial camera. The highlight roll off on this camera is beautiful. It does not look like a DSLR. This easily looks like a proper cinema camera. And when you consider the hardware and all the work that Panasonic has put into this camera, it's no surprise that this camera looks so good. And the other thing that really sets this camera apart is the fact that it does 10-bit color internally at 422. And you might be like, what does that mean? That sounds really geeky. Well, it is geeky. It's geek talk for this camera gives you a super robust video file. The video out of this camera is going to look as good, or at least very, very close to a $10,000 professional camera. And when it comes to color grading and adjusting your colors in post-production, you are going to have the same flexibility as a $10,000 camera without a doubt. And depending on what resolution or frame rate you're shooting, you're going to get anywhere between 100 to 200 megabits per second in a video file, which is pretty impressive. Which brings me perfectly to the sensor in this camera along with the frame rates. So one of the really impressive things about this camera is the fact that it's less than $2,000 and it's full frame. And in case you don't know what full frame is, basically it's a larger sensor size that mostly professionals use. In terms of frame rates, this camera does 4K up to 30 frames per second in 10-bit color in 422, which is a lot of color data. And if you go to 4K at 60, it switches over to 10-bit color at 420 with unfortunately a really big crop, but more on that later. And when you're shooting in full HD, you get up to 60 frames per second in 422 10-bit color. And if you go to full HD at 120 frames per second, which is 4 times slow motion, you get 10-bit color at 420 color space. And also, this camera has a dedicated slow motion mode where you can shoot exclusively slow motion video up to 180 frames per second. That's right, 180 frames per second in full HD. In the slow motion mode, you do lose autofocus, but that's pretty common on most cameras. So let's talk about 4K at 60. I was kind of bummed out, but when you go into 4K at 60 mode, you get a pretty heavy crop where it goes from a full frame sensor to an APS-C size sensor. But before you get too bummed out, you have to realize at this price point, all the competing cameras don't go past 4K at 30 frames per second, and they don't do 10-bit color, they all do 8-bit color. So while the crop is pretty disappointing, you have to remember that this is still a really badass camera at an amazing price point. And you can really tell that LUMIX tried to make sure that this was a cinema camera because this camera comes with native in-camera support for anamorphic lenses. And in case you guys don't know what anamorphic lenses are, basically those are the super high-end professional Hollywood lenses. If you ever look at a movie and go, wow, that looks really movie-like, it's because it was shot on anamorphic. And this camera will give you native support for those lenses. But here's my favorite thing about this camera, because Panasonic really knew what they were doing with this camera. They were trying to make a mirrorless camera that looked and behaved like a proper cinema camera. This camera not only has multiple cinematic profiles built in, but it also has Vlog in 10-bit. It looks absolutely gorgeous. And if that wasn't enough, this camera can also shoot RAW. That's right, 12-bit RAW to an external recorder at 5.9K. Being able to get almost 6K RAW at 12-bit out of any camera is impressive, especially one at this price point. You're going to be able to get the same flexibility as something like a Canon C500 or a Canon C200 or maybe a Blackmagic G2. If you're a cinematographer that makes commercials and movies, you're probably going to go with the LUMIX S5. But if you're a content creator that really doesn't need RAW and you just want everything internally, you're probably going to go with the Canon R6. Because ultimately, as a professional, you have to look at this as an investment and see, are you going to make your money back with this camera? You guys have probably noticed I haven't mentioned the photo features of this camera at all. There's a reason for that. When it comes to photos, this camera really isn't that special. It does 7 frames per second in mechanical shutter, and there's an electronic video hybrid photo mode where you can do 60 or 30 frames per second, which is really fast, but only at 18 megapixels, and to be honest, the photo features in this camera are just kind of whatever. But the photos out of this camera do look really nice, and I am really enjoying the color science from the Lumix S5. So we know this camera looks really good in terms of video and image quality, but what about IBIS, autofocus, design? Because those things really mean a lot when it comes to whether or not you actually want to use this camera in the field. So let's talk about autofocus, because the autofocus in this camera is 7 out of 10. It is nowhere near as good as what Sony or Canon offers because it is still contrast-based autofocus. It is not phase autofocus. To test out the autofocus, I ended up shooting one of my fitness friends just casually stretching, and while it looked really good, the image is beautiful, the camera would just randomly lose focus. Sometimes it would do a really good job tracking it, and then other times it would just not do anything at all. However, I should mention this one thing. This camera is really geared and aimed towards cinematographers, people that really want to make a cinematic image. If you're that kind of person, chances are you're going to be focusing your camera manually and you don't really care about autofocus. However, what really impressed me about this camera was the in-body stabilization, and I have to say, blown away. When I first started using the Lumix GH5 in 2018, I was really blown away by the stabilization, and it seems like in the Lumix S5, that stabilization has only gotten better. All of the footage that I shot of my friend exercising is entirely handheld with in-body stabilization, and I have to say it looks really, really smooth. And on top of that, this camera is really good in low light. I shot this camera at 1600 ISO and 3200 ISO, and I was pretty surprised by how clean the image was. So let's talk about design, because ergonomically, Panasonic did everything they could to make this camera perfect for a professional shooter or a cinematographer. The first thing that blew my mind is the fact that Panasonic DSLR in your hands. It feels really good, it's a really robust camera, you can really put it through its paces, and it's also weatherproof. Oh, and in case you're wondering, this camera does not overheat. All of the Canon cameras like the R6, R5 overheat, the Sony cameras overheat. This camera does not overheat. And in terms of the ease of use, the ergonomics, the button layout, the menus, everything is really easy to use with this camera. I really felt like I could just pick it up and run with it. There was almost no learning curve. So, who is this camera really for? This camera is definitely not for content creators, vloggers, or anyone that does run and gun stuff. You guys need your autofocus to be rock solid. However, if you're a young cinematographer that wants to make movies, commercials, somebody that really wants to create a beautiful image and wants the horsepower in their camera to be able to craft that image, and you don't care about autofocus or built-in stabilization, you just want to create a beautiful image and you want to do it without having to spend a ton of money, this camera is honestly for you. With 10-bit color internally at 422 at 4K, you are going to get a gorgeous image. And if you're ever doing a really big project, this camera will also give you the option for RAW. And while you don't need to actually buy your external recorder, you could always rent an external recorder for that project. But this tiny little package is going to give a cinematographer everything that he could possibly want. This is without a doubt the best budget cinema camera on the market right now. By spending less money on your camera body, you have the option of having better lenses or even spending money on renting more expensive lenses and having this inexpensive body with a ton of horsepower. This camera is going to serve you really well. To be honest, this is my new favorite cinema camera.